The gas lamps hissed in the damp evening air of Lower Manhattan, casting long, flickering shadows against the brick facades of the tenement buildings. And steam, constantly churning with the sound of horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones and the distant, mournful cry of foghorns on the East River. She lived in the building directly opposite, facing his rear window. She did not smile, and neither did he. It was merely a collision of glances, a recognition of another soul trapped in the same grid of iron and brick. He would wash and shave in the basin in the corner of his room, and at precisely 6:15 he would lift his shade. Across the way, her shade would rise as well. He saw her laugh, a quick, bright gesture that she pressed behind her hand. When she saw him watching, she did not pull away. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, opened her window just an inch. Arthur did the same. Arthur began to feel the weight of unspoken affection pressing against his ribs. He wanted to tip his hat, to offer to carry the bag, to ask her name, but he stopped himself. He went to his room and sat by the window. The light across the way was already on. She was there, visible in the soft glow. She was not moving. She sat in a wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, staring not at him, but down at the courtyard below. She knew the yellow notice would be on her wall as well. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Their world, this fragile construct of glances and silence, was about to be demolished. The city that had brought them together was now tearing them apart, driven by the relentless hunger for space and profit. For the next week, the atmosphere in the court changed. The silent routine became frantic. Arthur watched her pack, seeing the stacks of boxes pile up in her room. He saw the landlord's agent, a man in a bowler hat, walk through her room while she stood in the corner, her posture rigid with defiance. They were ships passing in a storm, tethered only by the windows. Arthur spent his evenings searching the newspapers for rooms, finding nothing but squalor in the Bowery or expensive flats in Harlem that he could not afford. He realized with a sinking heart that he would have to leave the city entirely, perhaps move to Brooklyn or out to the countryside with a sister he rarely spoke of. The distance between Orchard Street and Brooklyn was only a few miles, but in their world of silent courtyards, it might as well have been an ocean. On the last day, the air was thick with humidity, promising a summer storm. The movers were loud, shouting commands as they carried furniture down the narrow stairs. Arthur's room was bare, save for his suitcase and the vase, now empty, on the sill. He stood by the window, his coat on, waiting. He saw her door open. She stepped out onto the landing that led to the stairs, dressed for travel in a heavier coat and a small hat pinned with a veil. She carried a single suitcase. She stopped. For the first time, she looked directly at him, not as a shadow in a window, but as a man standing in an empty room. She opened her mouth, and for a second, Arthur thought she might speak, that she might break the silence that had held them for a year. But the noise of the movers drowned out any sound she might have made, or perhaps her courage failed her at the final hurdle. Instead, she raised her hand. It was not a wave, but a simple, open palm pressed toward him, a gesture of farewell and gratitude. Arthur pressed his own hand against the glass. His fingers splayed, matching her gesture across the void. She turned then and descended the stairs, disappearing into the gloom of the hallway. Moments later, he saw her emerge from the front door of her building onto the street. He rushed to his own window, craning his neck to see the pavement below. She paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the court, at the clotheslines, at the brick walls that had been the container of their shared life. Then, without looking back, she merged into the flow of pedestrians on Orchard Street and was gone. Arthur stood in the empty room for a long time. The sounds of the city drifted up, the laughter of children, the rattle of a truck, the distant wail of a siren. He picked up his suitcase and walked to the door, turning off the lamp. The room fell into shadow. He walked down the 4 flights of stairs, his footsteps echoing on the worn wood. As he stepped out onto the street, he looked back at the court one last time. The windows were dark. There was no sign that anyone had ever stood there, no trace of the red scarf, or the chocolate, or the winter breath on the glass. He hailed a cab to the ferry terminal, leaving the lower streets behind him. He never learned her name, and she never learned his. There was no tragic ending, no weeping farewell, only the quiet closure of a door. In the years that followed, Arthur married a woman he met in a boarding house in Brooklyn, a kind woman who spoke often and openly. He lived a respectable life, worked hard, and grew old. But on summer nights, when the air was thick and the city noise died down to a hum, he would sometimes stand by his window and look out at the dark windows of the neighbors. He would remember the court and the girl with the dark hair, and he would feel a quiet, aching resonance for a love that was never spoken, a dangerous romance that lived entirely in the space between the glances.